That's become clear to me anyway, just talking with folks.
Yeah. Yeah, because people want to know like what's going on, what are you doing with it?
Yeah, why aren't you doing it quicker?
Right.
What do you mean you have to wait for someone to tell you?
Right.
But that, that's just the way they set it up.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I'm gonna.
good seeing you.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
So, quick question.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're good?
Here, yeah.
Do you want like 5-10 minute warning towards the end? Do you want to leave like 5 minutes at the end? Like, how do you want to do it?
Yeah, I'm thinking, I was told to shoot for 20 minutes, so I have this kind of set up for 20 minutes, but even if I go 18, I'm sure there's going to be more than 12 minutes of questions.
Yeah. Okay, so you don't need any time.
No, I'm good.
Okay, how do you pronounce your last name again?
Pappis.
Pappas, Costa Pappis. Gotcha. Okay, because I'll give you a brief introduction to start. Or just introduce you.
Yep.
Cool.
Sounds good. So we start on the mark, or do we just wait until people trickle in?
We have a bunch of people. We'll start at 1:45, so we'll just start at the mark.
Okay. All right. So you're doing intros?
Yeah, I'll just
Okay.
introduce you very briefly. And
Sounds good. Cool. Thank you.
yeah.
I mean, what the recommendations we made is based on looking at what's been done, what should be recommended,
Wow.
Hey, John, to the party. Yeah. Active. Cool. So we'll get started. Alrighty. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming. We're here talking about the federal transportation infrastructure funding. It's going to be an overview of the funding included in the latest 5-year federal transportation bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Thanks everyone for coming out. And here's Costa Pappis, who is the Vermont Agency of Transportation Federal Policy Director.
All right. Thank you. Are we good with the mic? Okay. All right. I've got some equipment here I got to use. We're recording this. So quickly, before I get started, just a show of hands. How many people are familiar with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also referred to as the bipartisan infrastructure? Just a show of hands. Oh, quite a number. All right. How many people are familiar with the transportation provisions of the IIJA? Much fewer. All right. This is going to help me kind of determine the level of detail I need to go into. Okay, so let's start off broadly, but what exactly is the IIJA? This piece of legislation is a massive public works bill. It encompasses different types of public infrastructure, transportation, clean water, power grids, broadband. It's really, really broad. And part of the spending are funding sources that already exist. So when you think of some of the clean water EPA programs or some of the Department of Transportation programs, that was included in this bill with another $550 billion in new money. So the sum of it is well over $1 trillion. And it's been talked about as being, the largest investment in public infrastructure since the 1960s. The Eisenhower interstate era was a time where there was significant investment in transportation. But during that era, there was also a lot of investments in water and sewer systems and power grids, et cetera. So it is a very large funding source, and I'm going to just show you on the transportation side what kind of dollar amounts we're talking about. Vermont is anticipated to receive over the next 5 years $1.64 billion. The public transit program, $83.1 million. the highway funding represents an increase of over 50% as compared to the last 5-year bill. So this is a large amount of federal money going to transportation, because one of the things this bill did is it included the 5-year federal transportation bill. We have one of these, and they're always updated. This piece of legislation actually included the authorization for the federal transportation program. And what you'll see is that the bill included primarily two major changes to the transportation program. One is the additional funding itself, which is major, and that includes a couple of new programs I'll talk about, but also it significantly expanded the number of competitive grant programs. So competitive programs is where a local government or a state will apply to the federal government for funding to either rehabilitate or replace a bridge, undertake some bicycle and pedestrian investments, really, rehabilitate an entire roadway if necessary. These competitive grant programs that used to be a small part of federal transportation have now grown into $100 billion over the next 5 years. That is by far the largest investment in competitive grant programs that we have seen. So let's look at some of these changes. I talked about the 50%, approximately 50% increase for highway programs. And again, these are the programs that we use to pave, to rehabilitate roadways and bridges, park and ride projects, bicycle and pedestrian projects. So all of that funding that we've been getting over the years increases by 53%. In addition, two new programs were created by the federal government, the first dealing with carbon reduction. So by carbon reduction, we're talking about projects and initiatives that reduce our carbon footprint. Think of public transit, think of bike and ped infrastructure, think of construction materials that reduce our carbon footprint. All of that is included in this category of $32.8 million over the next 5 years. The Protect Resilience program is also new. This is a program that has to do with ensuring that the infrastructure we build can withstand natural disasters so we don't end up in a situation where we're dealing with recurring flooding. And I mentioned flooding because that's what we deal with primarily, but it's really any type of natural disaster. If you were in Florida, the concern there would be hurricanes, earthquakes out west. It could be any type of natural disaster. And then there's also a couple of other programs that have never been funded previously from the general fund. Normally, transportation funding comes from the fuel taxes that we pay when we go to the pump. What Congress did in this bill is they included a lot of general fund dollars going to transportation. And the big one is a $225 million program to rehabilitate and replace bridges. Now, that's an acknowledgement that the state of the nation's bridge infrastructure is really not great. And you see that recurringly as part of transportation budgets where bridges play a really major role in the overall funding scheme. There's just a lot of funding that goes towards bridges, and that's what they did here. They also included a $21.5 million, and these are Vermont-specific numbers, for EV charging facilities, infrastructure. So these are the plugs that, when you have an electric vehicle and you need access to it in a public setting, that you can hook up and get the power that's needed. So all of the stuff highlighted in yellow is new. Let's get through the presentation. We'll deal with questions. So for those of you that like to pore over numbers, I'm not going to explain this in detail, but it kind of shows you, where the increase is occurring. And again, it's really, it's about a 53% overall increase in the funding. And it's a lot of money. I mean, this is, compared to the last 5-year bill, this is really significant. Let me talk a little bit about the evolution of federal transportation bills, because they use these really creative names when it comes to these pieces of legislation. They call them ICE-T and Safety Lou and MAP 21. And they are acronyms for something. I don't remember most of them, but what's important here is not so much the name as it is how has federal policy evolved for programs and for funding over the years. So if we go back 30 years, there was a sense that there wasn't enough planning being done for all the transportation investments that were being made. You know, there were projects happening everywhere, but they weren't really coordinated in a way that made sense. So that's the era where local planning and regional planning became embedded in legislation. Over the years, modes and types of transportation that weren't really acknowledged in the past started to get incorporated. So this is when we started getting a lot of bike and pedestrian programs and funding, and also what was referred to at the time as multimodal transportation. That is the connection of different modes so you can seamlessly get from one to the other. So ensuring that a rail station had sidewalks, because when you get off the train, you'd like to walk somewhere. You know, these things were not part of previous transportation bills. This was new at the time. Then we shifted into an era of what I call broadly economic competitiveness. So this was around the time free trade agreements were being signed. There was a change in the economy shifting from manufacturing to services that not everybody agreed with. And what we saw during this era is a lot of focus on transportation infrastructure that would allow us to compete internationally. So there was heavy investment during this era on interchanges and major roadway expansions, major bridge projects, to make sure that our transportation system was capable of functioning properly in the 21st century. Now we get to where we are with the IIJA, and what's going on here is that in addition to everything else I've talked about, there are elements of priorities in Congress that are also generally shared with the administration in Washington, where we're seeing carbon reduction feature very prominently. So that partly explains the funding set aside for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for some of the other carbon reducing programs, resilience, making sure that, you know, our infrastructure can withstand natural hazards, which had been increasing over the years. It's kind of getting worse when you look at things like the intensity of flooding and hurricanes and some of the other hazards. Equity, how do we ensure, you know, that everyone can fully participate in the transportation, in mobility, in transportation infrastructure and investments? And asset preservation. You know, there's a real concern among some members of Congress that we keep expanding and expanding our transportation system and not necessarily preserving what we have already. And then you get into this cycle where there's never enough funding to take care of all the bridges, all the roadways, whether they're state roadways or local roadways. And that's really what's reflected in the IIJs, this idea that before we start expanding everything, let's make sure we're taking care of what we have. These are the public transportation numbers, and similar to the highway program, although clearly not the same scale, there was an intent here to provide increased funding over the years, $83.1 million over the next 5-year period. That's a $22.5 million increase over where we were in 2021. Okay, the grant programs I alluded to earlier, again, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on these because we can spend weeks talking about these different grant programs. But the idea here is that there's 26 grant programs in this legislation, 20 of which are brand new, that there's no precedent for them. And they come out to about $100 billion, which is by far the largest investment in competitive grant programs the federal government has ever made when it comes to transportation. So think of these grant programs as encompassing literally anything you can think of involving projects along a highway or public transit infrastructure, and it's likely eligible under at least one, in many cases, multiple of these programs. So things like replacing bridges, rehabilitating roadways, downtown revitalization, resilience, carbon, healthy streets, safe streets. All the programs are fortunately appropriately labeled so you can actually tell just by reading the title what the program is. And I'm going to show you a few of them here. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. The ones highlighted in yellow are the ones that the Agency of Transportation have applied for in the past. Anything that's not shaded is essentially a new program. So this is where you see, traffic programs, bridge programs, rural surface transportation programs, healthy streets, safe streets. It's quite a list. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you stand, there's a lot of documentation on each of these programs. So these are not as simple as pulling up a fact sheet. There's actually a lot of detail that goes into what's eligible, what's not, when should you apply for these programs, who can apply for them. And they are all available on the Department of Transportation website for those of you that want to dig into more details. So some of the risks that are associated with this piece of legislation, one of the things that Congress did, which was also unique, is that they undertook what they call a they included appropriations for part of this bill. So normally what happens is the authority to do something is in one bill and the appropriation lies somewhere else. In this case, a lot of these programs have been essentially pre-funded by having an advanced appropriation, but not all of them, and that's where one of the risk factors comes in, is that we don't know from year to year if Congress is actually going to agree with the numbers that are in this piece of legislation. They may decide, we want to spend more money on transit this year, or bridges are more important this year, so they can change things when it comes to appropriating funding for it. The second thing, and this has us very concerned at the Agency of Transportation, I think most people are concerned with inflation because it's having a pretty significant impact on how we fund projects. Everything is getting more expensive. And when everything gets more expensive, what it means is that you can do more with more money. The purchasing power of funding loses value when you're dealing with significant cost escalation. And that's what we're seeing at the agency, and I know local governments have told me the same thing, is that the cost of everything goes up, so the dollar doesn't go as far. And this is something that's keeping us up at night because it's the second consecutive year that we're dealing with inflation that's coming in officially at 8%, but we're seeing cost escalation that go beyond 8%. So our worry is that if this keeps going for a few years, that a big chunk of all this additional funding will essentially evaporate because it's not going to be available in real terms. So I tried to keep this high level and kind of brief because when I do this presentation, there's typically questions that I get. So I'm going to stop here, and I believe we have about another 10 minutes left, roughly 15. Okay.
In terms of eligible recipients on the competitive grant programs, I wasn't quite clear. Is it only governmental entities? Does it vary from program to program, or what's the core around that?
It's primarily government entities, local and state governments. There are a couple of programs that allow nonprofits to participate, but generally these are local or state government eligibilities. There's also airports and railroads. I didn't talk about that much, but there are other eligible candidates. I had a number of nonprofits actually reach out to me, and what I told them is there's nothing preventing a nonprofit from teaming up with the local government if they're interested in a particular project. That is allowed. The eligible entity has to be a local government, but there's nothing preventing a nonprofit from teaming with them. Yep.
Thanks. Are most of these highway programs 80-20, 80 federal, 20 state or local? And are there any concerns that VTrans has in terms of having enough funds for local match?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so the programs that we normally get, so the funding that actually comes to the state, not the grants that we apply for, generally pay for 80% of the cost on a state highway, and 90% of the cost on an interstate highway. There are some tweaks that were made to this legislation that allows the federal share to go up. So the resilience program that I talked about earlier, if you develop a resilience plan and follow it, they'll allow you to go up to nearly 100% federal funding. That's also true for some of the safety programs. There are certain safety programs that are 100% federal, and others that allow you to go up to 100% federal if you get creative in how you use the funding. Then you can transfer funding back and forth between programs, which is an interesting exercise in itself. In Vermont, some of the highway funding goes into the transit program. That's a transfer that's allowed. So there are different ratios, but generally it's 80% for the state highways, 90% for the interstate highways.
I was just wondering, you made a comment about the gas tax being the source of revenue for the projects, then that it typically doesn't come from the general fund. And my understanding with the stagnation of the federal gas tax, it hasn't really been covering the true cost of transportation projects for a while. So I was wondering if you knew what percentage of the funds that the feds provide to us, for example, is actually from the gas tax before this most recent bill.
Yep, that's a really good question. So prior to this bill, about 75% of transportation funding did come from the Highway Trust Fund. So that's when we go fuel and we pay our 18 or 19 cents per gallon. And you're right, that has been declining pretty significantly year after year. So there was a point where maybe 15 years ago, whatever was collected through federal fuel taxes equaled what was going to states for that's no longer the case. It's about 25%. This piece of legislation completely throws off all the numbers because a lot of these programs were funded from the general fund, and it's not clear if they're going to continue. We're not really sure what's going to happen when we get to year 5. Are they going to keep going at this pace, or are they going to revert back to what's more an ordinary 3% increase in federal funding? But your point is really well taken. It's been several years since the Highway Trust Fund fully funded the federal transportation program. But what this legislation does for bridges and for EV infrastructure, it's just 100% general fund. There is no fuel tax money that goes into some of these programs. I need the mic as we're recording this.
Great. Costa, thanks for this. Based on a presentation that I made earlier, there's been an emphasis on trying to recognize that certain communities have had disproportionate access to apply to the grants. And I'm just wondering from VTran's perspective, have there been any efforts at this point in time to try to say, hey, community X, we think you'd be really good for this. We'll help you do all of this work on your behalf. Is there any part to kind of maybe delegate and take on that responsibility on behalf of communities that might benefit from these grants?
Yeah, so this is where it gets a little tricky, because the way this legislation is laid out, the federal government wants a direct relationship with local governments. So in the past, programs like this may have required the state to serve as the intermediary between a local application and the federal application. That's no longer the case. Communities apply directly to the federal government for most of the programs that I put on the list before. So I think I'm partially answering your question as to, the relationship. Yeah, and we're competitors, right? We are going to compete for this funding, and so are local governments, and, may the best application win. There is an initiative at the federal level to get that technical assistance to applicants that have a hard time putting applications together. And I'm presenting kind of a simplified view of these grant programs because there is a lot of work that goes into them. They require very detailed narratives. They require benefit cost analyses. They require infrastructure reports. They're not all simple. And the federal government acknowledges that, and they've been discussing setting up a technical assistance apparatus. What that's going to look like, we don't know because they haven't developed it yet. But there's really two possibilities. The first is that the federal government will undertake the assistance directly with local governments, or the second is that they can delegate that authority to states. And if that materializes, it's going to be still friendly competition, but I think there'll be more resources for that purpose.
Costa, thanks. So I don't have a question. I think I have more of a statement or a comment or a recommendation. And by the way, the technical assistance program at the federal level is already in play, as well as the community engagement guidance. So that stuff is beginning to roll out right now. What I'd say is what VTrans could do or should do is to be intentional in this effort. Is to say we're going to set aside a certain amount of this business that we are going to commit to ensuring that black and brown and poor folks who ordinarily would not have that opportunity, that they would have it, and we're going to protect that outside of your friendly competition. Because I think if we were intentional, then the money is going to get where we would hope that we would like it to go. Not like ARPA intentional.
Yep.
Not like CARES intentional. I'm talking about intentional, where we really want the money to go where we want it to go. And that means translating the technical assistance that's coming from the federal level and taking it up on yourself as a state. All hands on deck. Get some folks committed to doing this work that you call equity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would go further than that in that for the federal program, that's actually a requirement. So this isn't an activity that's optional. We were talking about the grant programs, but the big part of our federal funding is the funding that comes to us directly from the federal government. There's no applications needed. We don't have to do any of that. And we're working right now on a transportation equity plan that's aligned with the Environmental Justice 40 initiative at the federal level. And the idea there is to go beyond just the programming of projects, but to get the engagement. That's the critical part, because part of this is the investments need to occur in certain areas. But who decides what those investments are? So
yeah, let me just clarify what I was saying, because
Yep.
I'm familiar with your Title VI responsibilities and how all of that works, and I'm also familiar with what's going to be coming out in the beginning of 2023, and that really has more to do with that process in terms of how do you decide the priorities on the road, on the projects and so forth. I'm talking about what I was really commenting on is more specific to this particular funding that's coming out in these new programs and the rules that exist at the federal level, and that if we're careful, what we can do is we can knock down some of the barriers that exist for access to this new money that we're talking about. I mean, I don't want to come across as being oblivious to the ongoing work, and although I don't think it's enough and I think it's misdirected, but Michelle and I can talk more about that. But I think that it's important for us to stay focused on what you're just presenting to us here in terms of the new money that's coming down and the rules that exist from the federal government regarding municipalities and, more importantly, nonprofits and those partnership opportunities that exist, and that would sometimes be competitive with VTrans, and where in conjunction with these new programs, there is technical assistance. And that's what I'm talking about is how can you take your understanding of that technical assistance and translate it in such a way where we can cause these dollars to reach the places where they need to reach. So I think we're talking about apples and oranges right now. So I want to make sure we're talking about the apple, not the orange.
Yeah, all right, thank you for that comment.
Of the 20 new programs, which was sort of most interesting or, I guess, very forward-thinking that, you would identify? I'm just sort of curious, because you went through them so fast. Like,
Yeah, and
which are exciting and different, or, you think will move us forward in a significant way?
yeah, so I'm pulling up the list here, and honestly, when you look at these titles and, a general idea of what they entail, I think most of these look very enticing. You have EV infrastructure funding, you have resilience funding, local project funding. It really depends on what your priority is and what you're zooming in on to kind of focus your application. Here's the rest of the list. I know I'm not doing this justice by going through this list quickly. Safe streets, public transit, active transportation. It really runs the gamut. And the encouraging thing here is we're talking about some pretty large dollar amounts, right? So these are, some of these programs are funded to the tune of $5 billion, so that would be $1 billion a year. These are funding levels we've never seen before. So a little of everything is how I would answer your question, depending on what you're interested in.
Just two questions, and apologies, I came in late, so you may have answered this already, Costa. What is the time horizon on how long you have to grant application to when the project needs to be completed for these? Or maybe they're all different.
Yeah, that's a really good question. They are all different. So there is no consistency from program to program. Some programs, the DOT wants you to get started pretty quickly, and these programs would require that engineering plans be completed. So these aren't we have a great idea, we'd like to get some planning funds to develop our concept. They need to get started pretty quickly. Other programs, and that would include a majority of the ones on the list here, do provide both planning and construction tracks. So if you have a good idea that you want to flesh out and prepare it, so do the planning, the engineering, the permitting, you can do that, and kind of the logical sequence is you would be ready for a capital grant. I think most programs are kind of in the middle. They will allow you several years to complete a construction project, whether it's a roadway or a transit facility, any type of capital improvement. An applicant that's notified that they have been awarded funding, there's usually a few months to sign a grant agreement, and then there's a few years to undertake the project. So we're not operating in an environment like we did back in 2008, 2009, where we were told whatever shovel ready needs to go to construction immediately. With this legislation and these grant programs, you have a lot more time to think through about, what should I be applying for? Is there any planning that's needed, any design work or permitting? And that can align things in a way that makes more sense time-wise to implement a project, with the hope that inflation is going to normalize and we're not going to be dealing with, uncertainty and difficulty putting together cost estimates.
Thank you. And then my second question had more to do with rail and what you see AOT's vision around just the billions of dollars that these grant programs are offering for rail improvements. Do you see us moving towards, and you may not have an answer for this, but do you see us moving towards commuter rail proposals or improving our passenger rail with the available funds? Is that even possible with this grant program?
Yeah, so we don't have any commuter rail plans, but intercity rail, we on a continuous basis rehabilitate our tracks. So the Ethan Allen Express that was extended to Burlington, that was a lot of concentrated work between Rutland and Burlington to essentially create the track to be in pristine conditions. But there are segments along the way that do need some rehabilitation, and we anticipate just continue what we've been doing for the past decade, which is making those improvements to make sure the trains are operating at the right speed, they don't have slow orders, you know, you don't want to slow down when you're traveling necessarily. And then there's the freight rail component to that, which, you know, the state owns 305 miles of active rail, and we are required to maintain it. So investments to rail bridges, to track, all the infrastructure that's associated with rail is something we're hoping to continue to tap into. And I say continue because we've been doing it for the better part of 15 years.
So, sorry, we're out of time. We're a few minutes over, but there's nothing in this room after this because the next presentation on transit funding alternatives was moved to the big room as our second keynote, as our original keynote wasn't able to make it. So if you're able to stick around and answer